And South Africa will be observing Human Rights Day on Sunday, the 21st of March. Today marks the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which coincides with our very own Human Rights Day. Although South Africa comes a long way in dealing with apartheid and discrimination, racial discrimination remains rife and affects all corners of society, including the workplace. To take this discussion further, we are now joined via Zoom by CEO of Afrika Tikkun service, Onyi Nwaneri. A very good afternoon to you, ma'am. Thanks so very much for being with us here on SABC News.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
You know, racial discrimination remains rife, and I'm sure, and in your studies and as you look at the issue, you have found that it is very rife, particularly in workplaces too. It does, though, seem to me that, you know, we have these conversations, we write all these pieces about racial discrimination, and often these conversations are aimed more at the victims of racial discrimination, because the aggressors are not particularly willing to partake in these conversations, because it would mean having to reflect, introspect, and change essentially. How do we change that?
Well, I want to believe that the first step is in acknowledging that we have a problem.
Yeah.
And that we have a problem that we need to first agree that it exists. It's like the concept of privilege. Everyone argues, does privilege exist, doesn't exist? You know, should people work hard to get to where in life? Should we acknowledge that people have worked hard or not worked hard? The key is that whether we like it or not, racial discrimination exists in this country and exists all over the world. Whether we like it or not, concepts like privilege does exist, and that certain people have already an advantage over the other. And so it starts with acknowledgement, and then it moves from, you know, how do we take steps in the right direction by taking accountability of our role, intentionally or unintentionally, in bringing about change and progressing from what was status quo into a positive environment.
Yeah, you know, you talk about, you just give that example, great example there, when we're talking about the issue of privilege and, you know, being able to say, yes, privilege does exist, but those that are privileged are very likely to say that's not true. Privilege doesn't, in fact, exist. So there is a concerted effort to kind of hide the truth, or to a total refusal, really, to take accountability, and how, you know, and the onus shouldn't really be on us to be making the job easier. You know, one should take accountability, and I'm just wondering how that's to be done, because it seems that the effort is having to be made from the side of the victims.
No, absolutely. I want to start off by saying that the stats do not lie. For example, if you look at the 2020 study that was done by the Commission of Employment and Equity, you know, those stats absolutely say that majority of that white South Africans, who comprise 9% of the country's workforce, occupy 66% of the top managerial positions in the country. And then the majority of the country, which is Black employees, who constitute 75% of the workforce, fulfill only 15% of the top positions. Again, majority of all these populations are male. The facts are not lying. So I think in terms of understanding the facts, and they are independent facts from independent institutions, I think we need to agree to those facts. Yeah. And so if we agree to those facts and say that the facts do not lie, then the big question is to say, if those are the facts, whether we like it or not, then what do we do? How do we create diversity? Should we start looking at diversity policies? How do we create an inclusive environment? How do we create the rainbow nation that Nelson Mandela wanted, not just for the country, for our companies, for our friendships? For example, you know, I'm the CEO of a corporate, and unless I am absolutely accepted, you know, I'm using that example. It's natural that you want to be friends with friends of the same color with you. If you want to be if you want to do social circles, you want to bring people who look like you, who speak like you, who have the same culture.
Yeah.
But if you recognize that just doing that is okay, but if you want to change status quo, then you have to start saying, in my company, in my social circles, how do I intentionally bring people who don't look like me? How do I include people who are different from me? How do I make sure that I am sensitive to the needs and to the interest of a rainbow nation and to an inclusive society?
Yeah, ma'am, my biggest issue when we're talking about diversity policies in the workplace and, sensitivity courses that they'll sometimes have, racial sensitivity courses that, corporates will often host for their employees, is that these often focus on open racism, on clear racism. Racism doesn't always, isn't always clear, isn't always open. It can take place in a very sort of unclear, passive-aggressive kind of way. Certain attitudes that you can't even take to HR, and there's no recourse for you because you can't say, oh, well, it's in the way that someone has behaved. And it's really clear to the person who's feeling it, who it is aimed at. And so I'm wondering what more is being done. I know you've done, comprehensive study on racial discrimination, and no doubt you've also done some work on exactly what I'm talking about here. I mean, what kind of recourse could there be there where you can't even pinpoint to say, well, this person called me the K word, for example. It's not always clear racial discrimination. I mean, there are undertones of it. There are things that you and I know that we can feel that I'm in an environment here that is not welcoming to me because of my skin tone.
No, absolutely. And that's why if you look at our press release, as our experience as Africa Tikkun Services is that, when you look at most of the racism that we experience in the country, it is often disguised as micro behaviors and micro actions.
Yeah.
And oftentimes these micro behaviors and actions are invisible to unaffected parties. And sometimes because it's invisible or it is subtle, it makes it difficult for victims to report their experiences to management, for example, in a corporate environment. And especially if management comprises of people belonging to those unaffected groups or management is insensitive to that. So what we propose, particularly in the workplace, in society, is that we should turn our workplace into a place where everyone can thrive mentally, everyone can be who they want to be without judgment, where there's inclusive workspaces, or gatherings or environments where that makes it easy for employees to report unfair treatment, and where unfair treatment is reported, that we hold perpetrators accountable. And in that holding perpetrators accountable, it has to be regardless of rank. It has to be with effective measures and steps taken to prevent transgressions in the future, no matter how small it is. So if someone says, I feel that someone had sort of performed a micro action that I perceive to be racist, that the company takes it seriously and investigates it, and if there is a need to sanction, because the only way we can change status quo is by holding people accountable and by having almost a zero tolerance to micro behaviors, no matter how subtle, or micro actions, no matter how small, that smacks of not the corporate culture that we want to have. And to be honest with you, one of the golden rules we want to really suggest to corporate is that if we want to change corporate culture, then there has to be a platform or a culture of listening without judgment.
Yeah.
There has to be a culture of dialogue. There has to be a culture of learning and unlearning some of the things that we would take for granted. When someone, for example, a woman says, I think that person acted in a way that is inappropriate, you just don't turn around and say, oh, but you wore a miniskirt today, therefore you deserved it. We have to learn and unlearn practices or things that we would have considered acceptable or not, or very trivial, and show empathy, no matter how trivial the comment is. So it's really about changing our corporate culture, changing the way we do life in general as individuals, and beginning to enable people, to be who they are, but at the same time be bold enough to report any action whatsoever, no matter small.
All right, it's been a really informative conversation. Thank you so very much for giving us your time here on SABC News. Much appreciated.